certainly have fears that there is a serial killer at loose in Perth.
Sarah Spears, Jane Rimmer, Ciara Glennon.
And every time you saw a young girl walking by, you think, oh God, is she going to be the next victim?
Now, one man stands accused.
If police are right and Edwards is the Claremont serial killer, he's been hiding in plain sight for 20 years.
There was just one extract of Bradley Edwards' DNA created in the Pathwest lab. Today, court heard it was in storage for almost a decade. Welcome back to Claremont in Conversation. This is day 56. Natalie Bonjolo, Tim Clark and criminal defence lawyer Damien Cripps with you today. Tim, this is pretty important because surely this does narrow the opportunities for contamination.
Yes, Nat. So this goes to the window of where the prosecution say there possibly could have been a contamination, but there wasn't, because as we discussed yesterday, the items of significant importance for Ciara, the fingernails and the sample from Mr. Edwards that was taken from Karrakatta were never opened together, they were never boxed together, they were never tested together, they were never run even together, and it seems they were never even on the same shelf together. And the little bit of evidence that we heard about that this morning just reinforced what was heard yesterday. So, and as you said, there was just one swab taken with Mr. Edwards' DNA in it. The extract was created, and then that was done in '95, days after the rape at Karrakatta occurred. And then the extract was created in '96, was tested in 1999, and then it went into storage and stayed there until September 2008. And so that is why the prosecution say it's fantasy or fanciful to suggest that the contamination could have occurred, because the extracts, the samples, the exhibits were never, ever close enough for that to happen. And Mr. Egan, Scott Egan, his best quote on that was one of his very last quotes last night when he was basically asked, so if this was to occur, how could it have occurred, Mr. Egan? And he said, and I quote, the DNA would have had to get out of the tube with the lid on it, out of the box that has the lid on it, through the box with the lid on it, and then into the tube with the lid closed on it. So it goes right back to right back at the start of the trial when Ms. Barbagallo said DNA just doesn't fly around the room. And in Mr. Egan's opinion, it would have had to do more than that. It would have had to have superhuman powers to get through a lid, through a lid, through a lid, and then through a lid for that contamination to occur.
I mean, Damien, as a layperson, to me this sounds, really open and shut. There was no way this DNA could have gone out, and so how could it possibly have been contamination that Mr. Edwards' DNA was found under Ciara's nails?
Well, we haven't heard from the defence yet. And the reason I say that, Nat, is because I'm not in a position where I've got all the information that team has. So I would imagine that they are prepared to... am I correct in saying that, Tim, we haven't heard from the defence in relation to this witness yet?
We did get some cross-examination today, Damien, and he did go to contamination events, but this key one, this possibility of AJM42 being contaminated, he can't really go there, and he hasn't really gone there because they can't actually pinpoint a point in time when it might have occurred. So what he did go to today was the documentation surrounding AJM40 and 42 before it went to the UK, and maybe possibly pointing out, well, the documentation wasn't really gold to platinum standard up to 97, 98, and so there might be a little bit of uncertainty about the total continuity. So that's where he went with it today. But in terms of the contamination, he couldn't really go there because they can't find anything, any point in time that it could have happened.
So Mr. Jovich, or one of his team members, did take the opportunity to cross-examine Mr. Egan in relation to it, but based on what he didn't say, you're telling us that it appears like there's no real armour for him to attack.
Not that particular point, I don't think, even though he raised it in his opening, that is the possible way it could have happened. But what he has done is he's gone to all these other contamination events that we discussed at length at the end of last week, and today we found out about even more contamination events. That is where he's trying to raise the doubt in that, look, it's happened here, it's happened here, it's happened here, it's happened on multiple occasions, different exhibits, different times, so why couldn't it have happened, even though we can't actually say that it happened.
Well, Tim, we talked yesterday about Pathwest's lab error rate, which you calculated for us yesterday at being 0.16%, but Paul Jovich challenged that today.
He did that, yes. So that was based on, as we discussed yesterday, quality issues, 28 that Mr. Egan listed among 17,000 analyses, and you do the quick maths, and that's what he came up with, 0.16. Today, Mr. Jovich questioned him and challenged him quite strongly on that, because he pointed out, on the one hand, that one of those errors or one of those quality issues actually pertained to 5 separate contamination events that were all discovered at the same time at Cellmark. So that obviously bumps the number up. And then he pointed out some more issues in terms of labelling, in terms of mislabelling, that he asked Mr. Egan, well, wouldn't you consider that maybe a quality issue? Well, possibly I would, and it wasn't on your list. No, it wasn't. So what Mr. Jovich was trying to do today, quite forcibly, was bump that number up. And so when you do the calculation, obviously, it goes up a lot, a little bit, but significantly higher than Mr. Egan said. And the most significant of those, to my mind, today was 4 more contamination events that we hadn't heard of previously, that in addition to the 7 that we heard of end of last week, and they were all involving Jane and Ciara's exhibits, and they were all, again, embarrassing for Pathwest to have to admit to and explain about.
Tim, can you tell us what those 4 events are?
Yes, so let's just go through them one by one. The first one that he raised was, again, in connection to Laurie Webb, who we've discussed ad infinitum in the podcast. He was a leading forensic scientist at Pathwest over a lot of the time that Claremont and Macro investigation was going on. There was a knife that was seized in relation to Ciara's case, not Jane's case, Ciara's case. We believe it might have been found in a taxi or something. We haven't had the real details around that, but whatever reason, it was seized. It was thought to be of interest. It was tested, and when those tests came back, it was found to be contaminated with Laurie Webb's DNA. There was a sample of Jane's hair that was found to have been contaminated by a female scientist's DNA profile, we learned today. There was a razor that was taken from Ciara's apartment when she first went missing that was later tested and found to be contaminated with Mr. Webb's DNA. And then there was also an earring, and we don't know the full details yet of whose that was or where it was found, but it was an earring that was seized in connection to one of the cases, and that was also found to be contaminated with a staff member's DNA profile. So on our calculations in court, that takes it up to 11 specific different instances of contamination involving Pathwest tests. 10 of those involve a Pathwest staff member, and one of those involves the unrelated victim that we talked about yesterday. So the error list, or the list of blunders, keeps going up, and in that context, you would say that the possibility of doubt being raised in Justice Hall's mind has to also be increasing.
I mean, I'm playing devil's advocate here, and these errors are further embarrassment for Pathwest. But I still think people listening will be saying to themselves, so what? They're not crucial exhibits. How does this help the defence case or hinder the prosecution case?
Yeah, well, I mean, that is the $64,000 question. What will Justice Hall make of all this? He's been very engaged. He's been asking lots of questions about contamination and testing and quality and how they're recorded and how they're investigated. So he obviously, just by the tenor of his questions, he's paying attention to this. But what he makes of it all, and whether he deems it hugely relevant to the actual case in hand, well, again, we're going to have to wait and see on that, but that will be one of the portions of his judgment and of his verdict when it comes down that will be very, very closely scrutinised by not just everyone involved in the case, but all of those that aren't involved in the case but have become involved over the coverage.
If you think about it quite logically, Tim and Natalie, one of the things that arises to people who are processing this in their mind may be, how could they deal with it? Like the individuals who are listening, everyone's taking part and listening, and people in Western Australia are thinking about how this is unfolding. And what seems to me is that obviously, as we discussed the other day, there's a lot that falls back to Justice Hall making the decision at the end of the day. But if people who are listening can logically process this, what Tim's just explained in their own mind, in that although we've got quite I think it was 11 that we came to 11 faults or mistakes that have been identified by Path West, but today it seems that there's been significant evidence that, on the prosecution's behalf at least, seeks to protect the crucial piece of evidence, which is the accused person's DNA arising on one of the victims, and if the listeners play that out in their mind, is ask themselves, would they be satisfied that what the prosecution had put forward today protected their case, even in light of the 11 mistakes or the 11 faults that had come up? The issue that you have with it is that those 11 mistakes, all they really speak to are the character of the testing and the character of what is taking place in Path West. It doesn't necessarily speak directly to what might have happened to that DNA that becomes so crucial in coming to the answer in this case. So then, I guess, Tim, and this will come up over in the future, I guess, in the process of the trial, is can that be attacked by the defence, the specific evidence in relation to Mr. Edwards, can that be further attacked in terms of contamination by the defence, and or can it be further protected by the prosecution? So as they go further towards the finish, that'll become one of the things that becomes key and central to the decision-maker's process. And Tim, are you of the view that we're signed off on that piece of evidence now, or is there more to come?
We're getting towards the end now of this, Damien, because as far as we understand it, Mr. Egan, being the reporting scientist, is the last of the Path West staff to give evidence, and then next week we go to Dr. Whitaker, which is concerning the actual testing done in the UK on AJM 40 and 42, and even on the defence case, the contamination must have happened prior to that, and then we go on to the statistical analysis of the likelihood of it being Mr. Edwards' DNA, which there's no real challenge about. So yeah, these couple of days have been crunch time, I think, for both sides, and that was why the pointed questions put by Ms. Barbara Gallo and the graphical representation of where the exhibits were at what time and in context with each other were so important late last night and then this morning, because after this, I think there's nowhere else to go for Mr. Jovich until he gets to. Well, I mean, obviously he's got his defence case to come. I mean, we don't know what his DNA potential DNA witnesses are going to be on the defence side. So he might have something. He might have something more to say when it comes to his turn. But in terms of really trying to land some blows on the prosecution case, today and parts of tomorrow are really his big show at it.
It's interesting, Damien, because when you ask us to think about this, put yourself in this position and think about how you would make a decision and what you would think of this evidence. And I sit here and I think, okay, well, if I was a juror, this would be so incredibly difficult. And it goes back to this idea, which is, you can see why there is someone of Justice Hall's calibre sitting in this position, because it feels at this stage almost impossible to see which way it's going.
So in relation to this evidence that we're talking about today, given what I've heard from Tim, I'm not of the view that this specific piece of information as it stands at the moment is so difficult to deal with, because if there was two samples of DNA, one being Mr. Edwards and one being Miss Glennon's, and they were sealed in containers from the date that you started the time test from, and they never crossed paths all the way up until today, then you couldn't possibly say that they were contaminated. And of course, what we've got in between those dates, Tim, as I understand it, is we do have a few incidents where the DNA samples were opened or moved around, but what the prosecution are saying is that they never crossed paths enough that they would be able to be contaminated. Yeah. Now, if you accepted that, there's not much scope to move from the argument that they could never have been contaminated. I think that's where we might have gotten to today, if I'm understanding Tim correctly. And Tim, correct me if you think there's something out of whack in what I've just said there. No,
that's absolutely spot on, David, and that's been the prosecution argument all along, that any notion of this happening is errant fantasy, was the way Miss Barbagallo put it in her opening, and fanciful was the way she put it yesterday.
But so then what does make it difficult is you do have these the test character flaws that have shown up.
Sloppy
procedures. But potentially I would think that what you would have to ask yourself about those flaws is, how can I use those? How can they influence this other bit of information that I've just been given? And I'm hypothetically saying, if we were to say that the two tests of Mr. Edwards, the two samples of one sample of Mr. Edwards and the one sample of Miss Glennon's that travelled impeccably through this time period, hypothetically, you couldn't, because you would just say, well, there's nothing to suggest that they are contaminated, so the contaminated samples and the flawed samples are somewhat irrelevant. All they do is show throw some doubt on the procedures in the lab and during the period, that long period of time. But if we got to the end of that period in relation to the two crucial pieces of DNA, it's pretty difficult to see how a contamination could have occurred. So on that front, Natalie, what I'm saying is it does make it a bit easier just in relation to those two key pieces of DNA, but certainly it's not lost on me that there's so much other evidence that's got to be considered in the context of that as well.
In a broader way, we're looking at hypothetical versus actual.
Yeah.
And didn't we have a revelation recently that contamination could happen through the air conditioning duct? That it could fly around the room, didn't we?
Just to confuse matters, yes, we did.
Well, I'm not trying to confuse matters.
As I said on the day, Daniel, that was an example from the lab in the UK, from Cellmark, and they were top class, and they're the ones that had the listeners remember, the air that flows in and the air that flows out of it, so even like minute particles, invisible particles in the air wouldn't get sucked in when the door was opened and all that. And they did have an instance of somehow a skin cell or something getting into the air conditioning and somehow contaminating. So, and that was obviously specifically raised by Mr. Jovich to make the point. But what I said on the day, and I still stand by it, is that was a different lab on a different side of the world at a different time in a different, completely different case on a completely different continent. So if we're talking about, a lot of noise, and there's been a lot of noise about all these contaminations at Path West. Is it white noise? Is it just static, irrelevant to what we are, really concentrating on, or could the judge possibly, put it all together and say, well, does it raise that doubt to such a level that I have to find that it could have happened, and that's what he's going to have to decide.
The most important thing about all of that swings on the back of that for the Western Australian people is it gives us a really good insight into what the justice has to go through. So all of these things that you might think about and go, well, it's not relevant. What you need to put into your mind is that this is what the decision maker has to go through. These are the processes that he has to go through to make that decision. So, yeah, they're pretty significant. Even though we're not commissioned with coming up with a result and an answer, there is someone that is.
Well, it's interesting that we're talking about, the hypothetical side of things, because I think, Tim, today, Paul Jovich did ask a hypothetical question which did actually cause some angst.
Yes, he did get a little bit underswept by the judge today. He was asking specifically about this evidence matrix that was created by Mr. Bagdonovicius in 2003, when he was asked to go through all the crucial exhibits and come up with a definitive list of what they had and what needed to be done to them and what could possibly be done to them in the future. And Mr. Jovich was asking in particular about a couple of the lines, and one in particular, AJM 40, where Mr. Bagdonovicius had written debris only and no analysis could be made, or something along those lines. And Mr. Jovich was asking Mr. Egan, well, was that really sufficient? Should he have made more notes? And was that note correct, given that what he did? And would you class that as a quality issue? And the judge basically, blocked him off and said, well, we know what Mr. Bagdonovicius said that he did. Just ask him about that. Don't ask him hypothetical questions, but based on something, on a construct that you're making of it. So that got a bit willing in the afternoon, and then later on, Mr. Jovich was also backed up a little bit when he tried to return to the same sort of questioning as well in a different area. So it just once again showed how on the ball Justice Hall was. I've got to say, Ms. Barbara Gallo also made some objections about relevance today as well. And look, this is the fourth day that Mr. Egan's been on the stand. It's been a long stint for him. There's been times where he's had to gather his thoughts. It's a long stint for him in the witness box. Very technical evidence, which needs a lot of concentration. And I think everyone will be quite relieved when we get to the end of this section of this week, because that will give us some light at the end of the tunnel that the DNA portion of the trial will be concluded.
Tim, what people can take from that is, I would suggest, is some comfort in knowing that you've got three teams, if you will, the court, the prosecution and the defence. And when, I'm going to use the cross-examination as an example, when the defence get their turn to cross-examine someone, they have to make sure, they're obligated to make sure that they sign off on everything that's possibly there that they need to ask a question about. I mean, this, you could never, put a list down of everything that you possibly can ask. But what you do need to do is make sure you get all the important points. Obviously, the obvious things that defence lawyers should ask or a prosecution should lead in their evidence. And what people should take some comfort about is that it seems from what we're hearing, that we've got 3 leaders of those teams that are playing their roles very efficiently. So Mr. Jovic is trying to extract as much information as possible under cross-examination. Justice Hall's saying, well, hang on, I don't think you need to go there. Mr. Jovic moves on to whatever the next subject might be, comes back a little bit later on, finds himself in the same realm, and Justice Hall pulls him up again. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think that's magnificent to know that system is working the way that it is, so that Mr. Jovic or the defence are filling their obligations, and the court is being kept moving along efficiently and trying to get all those, cross all those T's and dot all those I's the way they should.
So it's necessary, I guess, that both sides are at times trying to push the boundaries to get the full answer that they're chasing, if the answer is there.
Absolutely, and I think we'll see the same thing when the defence lead any witnesses, if they do, that the prosecution will stand up and they will cross-examine them to the nth degree to explore all the corners. Sometimes when you're exploring a corner you weren't necessarily meaning to explore, you find something you didn't anticipate was going to be there. But I think what we're seeing here is that Justice Hall is letting it go to a certain point that he's saying, okay, there's nothing there, let's stay where we need to be. So, I mean, I can imagine being in the courtroom, it would be arduous on the 4th day of having the same witness. It'd be terribly taxing on the witness, not only just having to answer the questions, but cast his mind back and keep himself alert to all the questions and what directions he's getting from the judge. And pretty heavy 4 days, I would have thought.
Yeah.
Well, there's a very interesting question for you, Damien, from Charlotte in East Perth. Would a lawyer from either side possibly use the tactic of keeping impactful questions for the end of the day so that the last point or answer the judge hears before they retire for the day? From reading the live blogs, it would seem a lot of the big issues are coming towards the end of court sitting days. Would that be a coincidence or deliberate?
I think that to some extent it would be deliberate, simply because when you think you've got a really significant point, you develop a tactic about how you will launch that point. And I'm obviously not sure on what the prosecution or defence tactics are in this case specifically, but if you had a tactic that you thought would be a bit mind-blowing, or it would be have a significant impact on the way that the decision-maker's thought process was working, you would potentially explore all the boundaries of that, just tread the waters around the outside of it to see that it was going to unfold the way you thought it was, and then you would say, okay, I've got everything set up exactly the way that I want it to be, and conveniently it's in the afternoon, so that this could be one of the last thoughts that not only the jury or the judge would leave with. So then you have that question towards the end of the day. Although, that being said, the impact can be the same at the start if you do it at the start of the day when the decision maker's mind is fresh and they've come in with a thought that they're going one way, and then you can lead them a different way. It might have the same impact, but I would think that in this case, and it's only my thoughts, are that the person, the case is that they're treading water around the issue to make sure that they've got all the information and it's the question set up the way that they want, and then they ask the question to have an impact such that it can resonate overnight with the decision maker.
Tim, do you know what's happening in court tomorrow?
Yes, so as we mentioned, Matt, cross-examination continues for Mr. Egan, so he'll go into day 5, but we're pretty sure that will be his last day. Mr. Jovic covered a lot of ground today, so he'll cover whatever ground is left tomorrow. Then there'll be the re-examination of Mr. Egan, and then that will be that for the week, and then we will all await with bated breath the arrivals, hopefully the safe arrival of Dr. Jonathan Whittaker from the UK, coronavirus permitting, and then he will hopefully, all being well, be in court on Monday to begin his evidence about the fingernails that he will report on and that we've been reporting on for seemingly weeks and weeks and months and months.
And still a while to go yet. Well, thank you both for your company, and thanks for your company today. We'll be back tomorrow for day 57 of Claremont in Conversation. We look forward to chatting to you then.
This podcast was produced by Kate Ryan and Alicia Preedy and recorded in the studios of 7 West Media. Audio files were provided from the archives of the 7 Network and the West Australian. Sign up for daily emails and all the latest on the Claremont trial at thewest.com.au.
Enjoying this podcast? If the story behind the headline matters to you, then you can count on thewest.com.au to deliver. For more on Claremont the Trial, follow the live blog, watch the nightly news updates, and sign up for daily email updates at thewest.com.au. Subscribe now for just $1 a day at thewest.com.au.